right, everybody. Welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Nick, he's Joe, and we've been talking U.S. politics here at the Universal Broadcast Center of all things conservative when it comes to talk radio. That's nowhere near what Joseph usually says, but we have our own style.
Well, you have your own style, Nick.
Yeah, I'm...
Donald Trump has his style, and you have your style.
That's right. I just wanted to maybe spend some time talking about, because we know what Trump brings to the table. And really, we can pretty much guess what Biden brings to the table based on his record as a senator. He's been a senator since, I think Moses and the Ark. But he's got really no record to speak of. He hasn't brought forward any legislation, has sponsored any bills. He's done pretty much nothing.
No. Well, first of all, I'm not going to deny. I'm not going to challenge your assertion that he's done nothing. I don't think he's accomplished anything. But in fairness, he has sponsored bills. He's brought forward legislation. In fact, one of the interesting things is that Joe Biden was a key sponsor of legislation that ended up, all of the complaints that you hear from Democrats and lefties about in the States in particular about how the prison population is disproportionately black, and the concerns about people serving long prison sentences for essentially for what could be characterized as minor drug offenses. That's Joe Biden. Joe Biden was a fervent supporter of legislation that instituted those policies, and so that's another example of how the left blames the right for its own sins, as it were, and the great example. Just if I could digress a little bit away from Trump and the current electoral process that's going on. One of the things that we still quite often hear when we talk about Vietnam, for instance, and we talk about Nixon, and Nixon wears Vietnam. Okay, you know what I'm saying?
He does.
Right, but the funny thing is that Vietnam was actually U.S. troops were actually committed to Vietnam by John Kennedy.
Right.
And after John Kennedy was assassinated, it was Lyndon Johnson, his vice president and Democratic president at the time, that really ramped it up. And Nixon, the Republican, was the one that ended the U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
Yeah, and he probably would have been able to been given credit for that if it hadn't been for this not a crook Watergate thing.
Well, perhaps, but but even today, okay, with the passage of 50 years, people are still, and it's kind of like this revisionism is that if anything that looks bad when it comes to civil rights or wars or anything like that, things that look bad are historically people tend to blame Republicans. And conservatives in particular, when in fact it's Republicans that have generally wanted to stay out of foreign entanglements. Historically speaking, it's conservatives that have said, we don't want to be involved in this war or that this conflict or that conflict. And as I said, it was Nixon that actually got the United States out of the Vietnamese quagmire. And when he left office, agreed totally under a shroud of controversy, he resigned because of the whole Watergate business. And I'm not diminishing that one little bit. But when he left office, and then shortly after he left office, North Vietnam laid on a full-on invasion of South Vietnam. That's why there's no North or South anymore. and there was a lot of pressure on the government to re-intervene. And it was a Republican president, Gerald Ford, who said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to stay out of it. We've withdrawn. We've washed our hands of the whole situation in Southeast Asia, and we're not going to re-intervene, even though the North Vietnamese communists have completely broken all of the agreements that we signed, which led to our withdrawal. So just a little historical tidbit of information there.
There's an old saying, and it's roughly true, is that Democrats start wars, Republicans finish them. And if you look back through history, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a few notable exceptions, but if you look at who was the president in 1914, if you look at who was the president in 1939 or 41, if you look at who the president was, and once you get up to Eisenhower and Korea was never really called a war in the first place. That was what they called a police action, and a UN-sanctioned police action. So that's why the Americans were involved. That's why we were involved. And then you go from there to Vietnam, started by a Democrat, finished by a Republican.
Yeah, well,
so there are some notable examples.
Sure, and just
exceptions to that rule, but in general.
Yeah, just for the sake of historical accuracy and in fairness to the individuals involved, with the Second World War, it was a Democratic presidency. You're right. It was Roosevelt was the president at the beginning of the war, and he saw it pretty much all the way through. He died in office in April of 1945 before Nazi Germany actually surrendered, a month before they surrendered. But the war in Europe was, for all intents and purposes, over. And he was succeeded by, of course, President Truman, again, a Democrat, who led the United States into Korea. And again, you're quite right. It was Eisenhower, Republican president, who negotiated the ceasefire in Korea. Now, that particular conflict hasn't been ultimately resolved.
Ceasefire is a bit of a loose word.
So. Anyway,
right.
But
and that when you use ceasefire, that's what it was. It wasn't the end of the war.
Correct. And the forces, large American forces still in South Korea, maintaining that border alongside the South Korean army. So it's you're right. But we've strayed away from the American current situation in the United States. Significantly here, Nick, and I want to come back to it because I think you asked a very good question. What would a Biden?
Off the course?
What would a Biden presidency look like?
White House look like presidency.
Yes. And I think we've talked about. I mentioned at the beginning of the show, at the beginning of the first segment of the show, I did mention that. This was the Democratic platform is pretty radical, and I think demonstrably unattainable.
It is,
so I continue to be surprised that so many people were prepared to vote for Biden, notwithstanding the awful platform that he was running on. I don't know how to explain that except to say that people just don't seem to like Donald Trump. But there is good news, and the good news is that the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, and so it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats, at least for the next 2 years, if Biden indeed wins, for the Democrats to impose their program on the United States. And,
now, let me ask you this question, Joseph, because I think you have a better grip on it than I do. How much can he do, and by he, I'm talking about any president, do by executive order?
Well, that's a gray area, and there's a lot that they can do by executive order, but it's not. I can't give you a definitive answer. I don't know all of the parameters around what you can and can't do. But there is a lot that can be done under executive order, but all of it would be challengeable. In other words, it's kind of like a moving target. And just because the president says I have the authority to just do this, doesn't mean that that individual states or citizens or the Republican Party itself, the Republican senators or members of the House of Representatives, wouldn't challenge what he wanted to do in court and say he can't do it constitutionally. Plus, remember that the executive branch, unlike here in Canada, the executive branch does not control money. So whatever the president wants to do, he could argue that he could do it under executive order, but somebody's got to pay for whatever it is he wants to do. And one of the things that Donald Trump has tried to do when his agenda was blocked is to say, okay, money has already been allocated within this department, and therefore, by executive order, I'm going to move the money around a little bit to accomplish what I want to accomplish, and because it's already been allocated, I don't have to go back to Congress and ask for more money. The border wall being one of those things, but it was controversial, and it still is. In other words, can the president simply reallocate money that has been appropriated for a specific purpose? I think you can make a very strong argument that he constitutionally doesn't have the authority to do that, he or she. So the executive order power is real, but it's limited. It's harder. It's funny because the executive branch of government in Canada has far more power. I'm not talking raw power here. I'm not talking to the strength of the military or anything like that. But in terms of leeway, the ability to do what it wants to do, the executive branch in Canada and in the Westminster system generally has far more flexibility to do what it wants to do than the American president does. It's kind of an ironic thing. And I want to make this observation, Nick, just very quickly. And that is, people complain, and a lot of Americans complain about gridlock, I'm sympathetic when people complain about political gridlock. They say, well, you can't get anything done. But the fact that you can't get anything done is an indication that there is no clear political consensus to get things done. And therefore, gridlock is actually something that intentionally or not intentionally was built into the American political system. And what it does is it basically prevents any political party from ramming through legislation and policies that are not, that there is no broad consensus for. So I'm actually, interestingly enough, I'm a fan of gridlock. If you can't get it through, then there's not a big enough appetite to do it, and it's one way, theoretically anyway, of limiting what the government can and can't do.
Yeah, I was hoping that was the answer because again, I don't want to draw from Hollywood because that's probably about as a reliable source as gun control. If you want to learn about gun control, just watch what's in the movies, right? Being a little tongue-in-cheek there, but the bottom line is there's a lot of people out there who think that the executive order is supreme to the way that they make laws down there through the Congress and the Senate and ultimately the Supreme Court. And that's one of the things I wanted to kind of dispel because it's